which is not the best time for a meeting in Washington, but you can still beat the traffic across the bridge to the Eastern Shore by the time we're done. This is really a wonderful meeting for us. It's the third meeting of a working group we've co-sponsored with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, which is run by a very old and dear friend, Nezar AlSayyad, to whom I will sort of pass the baton in a moment. But this group emerged from the work here of a really wonderful, then she was an employee, now she's just a friend, Mejgan Masumi, and I think Mejgan is here someplace. There she is. And this really, Mejgan, in many ways was the sort of the locomotive that pulled this group down the tracks. And it's wonderful to have Mejgan back in Washington and back at the center, even if it's only for a couple of days. I also want to thank Allison Garland and especially the relentlessly efficient Lauren Hertzer. I think Lauren's probably outside. There's Lauren being relentlessly efficient for getting everybody in the room. For those of you who don't know, I'm Blair Rubel. I'm director of the Comparative Urban Studies Project, and my role in this session is essentially to be the traffic cop. So if you haven't gotten the introductory material, biographical introductions to the speakers, it was available outside. And there are also summaries of the previous meeting that are available, which will help provide those of you who haven't been participants in the group a little bit of context. But I think with that, to maximize time for discussion, I'm just going to turn the floor over to Nezar.
Thank you very much, Blair. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. I'd like to particularly extend my thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to CUSP, the Comparative Urban Studies program of the Wilson Center, for allowing us the opportunity to return. The Wilson Center, as many of you know, has a great tradition of assembling teams of scholars, think tanks of sorts, who work for 6 months or a year on a given topic. In 2006, and that's exactly what Blair was actually referring to, I was part of one of these workshops on the theme of inclusive cities. My discussion with Mejgan, who was then at the Wilson Center, but who's an old student of mine, she's very young still, but she was definitely a student of mine at Berkeley, led us to the emerging subject of cities and fundamentalisms and the constitution of this group, whose membership has been open and changing, allowing us to add scholars from different disciplines as the need arose. Our first meeting, which occurred here, was a closed workshop that was dominated mainly by scholars from architecture, planning, and sociology. Our second was a smaller symposium in which we added scholars from political science and geography. And in this particular conference, our final meeting, we are fortunate enough to have most of the original members of the group, joined by a few additional scholars from anthropology, history, and religious studies. From the beginning, our intent was to help facilitate an exchange between scholars from various disciplines who are interested in the challenges posed by fundamentalist movements and organizations, with a special but not exclusive focus on religious ones, and with the hope of understanding how they are impacted by the urban condition and how they affect the urban landscape in return. We hope we will ultimately be able to produce an edited book as a result of this activity, which lasted literally a whole year. The relationship between fundamentalisms and cities is a very complex one. As this meeting, in fact, is recorded and open to the public, and I understand is even covered by the channel that broadcasts to the Arab world, Al-Hurra, the American sort of voice of America, if you will, I think it behooves us to start with a few very basic, simple definitions. The first use of the term, in the manner that we now speak of it, owes its origin to the early 20th century, particularly to Protestants, who stressed the inerrancy of the Bible and mandated its use as a binding historical document. Few would dispute, however, that today our present use of the term fundamentalism has very strong negative connotations. it is associated often with militancy and with regressive politics. The Oxford English Dictionary and the American Heritage Dictionary offer some different definitions on what fundamentalism actually is. I don't know if these speak to larger cultural differences between the two continents, but they agree on the following, that fundamentalism is simply the strict and inflexible maintenance of orthodox traditional beliefs or doctrines. That is indeed a definition that is totally independent, if you will, of the urban and the urban condition. A quick search on the web makes clear that, at least as far as digital space is concerned, fundamentalism is mainly religious and is reduced to a pathological condition of violence, conflated often with terrorist acts committed under an altered state of mind in which an individual has already been socialized. The supposedly unscholarly Wikipedia, interestingly enough, stresses the subjectivity of the term fundamentalism. A Google Scholar search leads one to articles mainly from psychology and psychiatry, but recognizes other forms of fundamentalism, which I think is very interesting because you don't find that in the dictionary definition, such as market fundamentalism. Martin Marty and Scott Appleby were among the first to recognize the upsurge of fundamentalism in the early 1990s. In their American Academy of Arts and Sciences supported fundamentalism project, which lasted between 1988 and 1993, they convened 10 conferences involving more than 100 experts, some of whom, in fact, Professor Williams is with us today. And they produced 5 volumes of case studies and essays that came out of these scholarly exchanges, in which they argued that there's a family resemblance within fundamentalism that, to a greater or lesser degree, unites movements within the religious traditions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. In their definition, fundamentalists are against modernity, but they're also modern. They support this view by the fact that the current fundamentalist groups have mastered technology in their drive to attract adherents and maintain their power base. And it's very interesting to note here that all of this work was actually happening way before we heard of Al-Qaeda, for example. They also concluded that fundamentalist practices are not simply conservative or regressive, but on the contrary, they are mainly reactive. These practices are the way some people and groups fight back against modernity, relativism, and pluralism, they say. I do believe that there's some truth to this particular position, one which may be relevant to our meeting. So what constitutes fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is often perceived in opposition to 3 basic tenets of the modern: the preference for secular rationality, the privileging of individualism, and the adoption of religious tolerance and relativism in terms of ethics and morals. This being said, it would be naive to think that fundamentalism exists in complete opposition to the modern world or its various manifestations. Indeed, the category itself is often less defined by a rejection of modernity than by social, ethnic, or nationalistic grievances, as we've experienced in the last 10 years. For example, many of these who self-define or are viewed as fundamentalists actively engage with the products and the processes of the modern, such as modern technologies, new media, and other scientific tools for their own purposes. Thus, one reading of this might be that the relationship between modernity and fundamentalism as such might be less antagonistic and more transactional. Hence, in this respect, fundamentalism itself may be considered thoroughly modern. Of course, the scholars of this particular workshop, particularly over the different meetings that we've had, have not agreed on one single definition of fundamentalism. And in fact, we decided we don't need to engage in this exercise. We got completely bogged down on it in our first meeting, and that was not very productive. We decided after that meeting that such an exercise would not be very useful, as the term has major theoretical limitations and practical repercussions. Theoretically, a fundamentalist, according to one group, may be the hero, the leader, or in fact even the innovator in another group or for another community. Practically, this sort of categorization also carries the risk of singling out and negatively labeling one particular religious or ethnic community. Instead, as you'll see over the course of the day, members of this particular group seem to have chosen terms like religious urbanism or moral activism to talk about the ideologies and practices that are popularly known as fundamentalism. Some members of the group also believe that fundamentalist movements are movements that are a direct and self-conscious response to the particular form of modernity that came out of specific Enlightenment ideas that diluted the role of religion as a public force, or specific colonial practices that attempted to contain religious influences in the public sphere. So are these fundamentalisms really new, and are they phenomena that should be understood as modern resistance movements, as we've been hearing? While fundamentalists often reject many of the values brought about by modernization, they seldom reject modernity itself or modernity's means. It is true that most fundamentalist movements invoke an invented history to justify their claims. But it's equally true that all nationalist movements did exactly the same thing in an earlier time. The only possible difference may be that fundamentalists invoke an essentialist history based on the belief in the inerrancy of text and hence the literal truth of the nation of God, while the nation state simply believes in the truth of modernity itself. If fundamentalism is a categorization based on religion, what has it to do with cities? The city may be important to the formation of fundamentalism. As an ideological framework, an urban space needs to be reinstated in our understanding of fundamentalist practices. However, our purpose has not been to probe whether fundamentalism is essentially urban or rural. That was not necessarily the main concern. Indeed, it changes from place to place. Instead, ours is an attempt to spatialize and to territorialize the logic of each type of fundamentalism, casting the discussion in terms of cities and citizenship, and not in terms of those strict or intolerant practices. I think two examples stand out here, and I spoke about them much more extensively in the earlier meetings, that help clarify the relationship between the city and its hinterland in the equation of fundamentalism, for me at least. The first is 19th century Wahhabism in Central Arabia, which was reinvented, if you will, in the 20th century with the now forgotten but extremely important siege of Mecca in 1979. And again, in the beginning of the 21st century with the events of 9/11. The second is what was known as Jama'at al-Takfir wal-Hijrah in late 20th century Egypt, that culminated in the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt. Both of these movements had a special mutually reinforcing relationship between the desert and the city. The desert in this case serves as the hinterland, where plans were concocted in the former, assumed to be the space of virtue and purity, to be executed in the latter, often condemned as the place of vice and infidelity. Another example that I think demonstrates this relationship between the city and the countryside may be the role of the village and the small town in the events around the Godhra train burning, which led to the Gujarat riots of 2002. The communal riots that followed have been represented in worldwide media as a clash between Hindu and Muslim fundamentalists. This is a reading of communal violence as the predictable outcome of fundamentalist ethos and motivated by religious zeal. However, the question that remains, and the question that is most germane for us today, is why is it that the events that unfolded in small and unimportant towns found their most violent repercussions in some of India's largest cities? It is not too bold to suggest that the question of space, particularly urban space, has been largely peripheral to the understanding of fundamentalism as a phenomena. In fact, when urban space is referred to, it becomes only the tableau against which fundamentalism is played out. For example, it is now common knowledge that the violence that swept through India's cities against Muslims following the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992 was motivated by the desire of certain Hindu groups to claim valuable urban resources such as property and water, and hence the elimination, if you will, abstractly, of Muslim bodies from the public sphere. In other words, fundamentalism served as the pretext for a larger campaign of land grabbing in which Muslims, in this case, happen to be seen as undeserving of urban space and possibly of citizenship altogether. Much of the work on fundamentalism and space either abstracts the urban as simply the microsite of the nation, or reduces it into a set of resources that serve as a subsidiary battleground for religious fundamentalisms. Our task is a different one arranged around one principal question and a number of interrelated issues and assumptions. And you notice here, of course, that in using the term fundamentalisms, I add the S. The S is very important in this case. We're not necessarily talking about movements that, despite their similarity in the strategies that they use, have fundamental essential bases. The main question is this: what makes a city a fundamentalist city, in quotes? From this, of course, follow a number of ancillary questions, like, is a city which deprives a particular gender from accessing its streets a fundamentalist city? Is a city which requires its religious minority to observe, or possibly even to obey, the dress codes of its dominant majority a fundamentalist city? Is a city which bans smoking and renders smokers a banished group a fundamentalist city? When is this line crossed? Who has the right to make this designation, and to what end? These questions are not simply rhetorical ones, as these conditions exist in many cities around the world, ranging from Peshawar in Pakistan to Berkeley, California, my own city. While cataloging the cities that would fit or escape the rubric of fundamentalist cities may be an interesting political exercise for the CIA or for national security agencies, I do not believe it is a serious scholarly exercise for us here. As a working hypothesis, and to start our discussion, let me venture a few attributes which make a city what I would consider a fundamentalist city. It is a city which categorically excludes, by law, tradition, policy, or latent practice, individuals who are adherent of another religion or who belong to a different ethnicity than those of the ruling power or the majority population. It is a city whose minority residents belonging to different ethnic or religious groups are denied access to basic urban services or to specific public spaces. It is a city whose religious majority mandates or practically expects that its minority groups have to conform to all the rituals of public behavior prescribed in the religious code of the majority. It is a city that is excessively gender segregated, as mandated often by a male-dominated society, to the point that its women have little or severely restricted access to public space. Finally, it is a city where many of the above forms of control or oppression are so normalized in everyday life and everyday practices that they are no longer questioned by the minority. Now, of course, you notice here I'm not making any universal claims. While some of these may apply to certain cultures, they may in fact not apply to others. And of course, this is also a very generic list that needs to be developed further to take into account the specificity of each case. And here we have to confront a number of issues and assumptions. The first issue